planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head propagandized. Big chocolate points, flat outlines. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's Podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello. Hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another Podcast by George. Got another great show for you today. Going to have a lot of things to talk about. Our featured guest is going to be Ariana Pekary. She's returning to the Podcast by George LiveLine because there's some new polling results out on the viewing habits of Americans, and most importantly, who they trust and who they don't trust. It's broken down by political parties. It's pretty interesting stuff. We're going to be talking about the folks that you watch on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and what that all means. And it's kind of a crazy day here in Iowa. We're delighted to have Ariana on to talk about media. But, the situation here is last night we were again having another round of tornadoes. I mean, terrible storms, particularly early like this, our second round already this year. And Dr. William Gallis, a lot of people heard me promote. He was going to try to join us on the show. He was out storm chasing last night. Got dark on him out there in the hinterland. He wasn't able to come on, but he will come on here very shortly. Maybe not today, but in the next couple of days anyway. I hope he can share some photos and some accounts of what he saw. There was some baseball-sized hail and some really bad storms, and it's really weird, folks. It was over 80 degrees here yesterday, and I think tonight it's going to dip down to 29 degrees. It's just bizarre. It's got to be related to the climate, and anybody that doesn't believe that, I've just got to kind of question, what they're thinking, what they're reading, and maybe what they're watching, and that's going to fit in very nicely to what we're talking about today, and as to what I'm reading and what I'm watching and what I can't believe what I see and why a lot of Americans can. Again, that's what we're going to be talking about with Ariana. Here's what I opened up and looked at today in the USA Today, the Nation and World section. No end to the war in sight. Putin vows to press the invasion until Russia's goals are met. And I thought, okay, great, because me, I'm a big peacenik, folks. I'm pushing for a ceasefire. Wars never end until a bunch of old men sit down at a table someplace, put their wrinkled old asses in a seat, and sign some papers. So I want to see that happen. It doesn't happen when you send arms and military and missiles and fighter jets and whatever the hell else they're talking about. That doesn't end war. That extends war. And most importantly, it doesn't end killing. It results in more deaths. So I was interested in this article. So I get, I'm reading along in this thing, and it reads in Mariupol, strategic port city in the Donbass, a Ukrainian regiment defending a steel mill claimed a drone dropped a poisonous substance on the city. It indicated there were no serious injuries. This just reads along like this. The assertion by the Azov regiment, a far-right group now part of the Ukraine military, could not be independently verified. Oh, okay. I'm reading this. Folks, you know who that Azov regiment is? Yeah, they're far right. Those folks have been accused since before this all started, really, of being Nazis. That's what we're talking about here. That regiment, it's heavily infiltrated by Nazis. Zelensky himself admits it. That's who we're using as our sourcing material in this article. Ukrainian President Zelensky said that while experts try to determine what the substance might be, the world must act now. What? Before you determine what the Azov battalion tells you, the world must act now? Yeah, that's what he's saying. The world must react now. Evidence of inhuman cruelty toward women and children in Bucha and other suburbs of Kiev continued to surface, he added, including of alleged, again, that key phrase, folks, alleged rape. So I mean, this is all part of what you may have heard Noam Chomsky refer to as manufacturing consent. I look at this and my God, this is really pushing for war hard. I'm kind of shocked and, not necessarily appalled at this point. Maybe I'm not even that shocked anymore, but it's really surprising. And then there's this. And you've heard me talk on the show before, and Ariana and I might get into this a little bit, but I tell folks there's no left wing presence on network television any longer. There isn't any left-wing peace presence on network television. If people that think they're getting a left-wing perspective, where do they go? They go to MSNBC. What are they saying on MSNBC? Watch this.
We are past the point of sanctions and strongly worded condemnations and the seizing of oligarchs' mega yachts. It's no longer sufficient as the evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity continue to grow. Vladimir Putin has no regard for life or humanity or even the rules of war.
Yeah, you recognize that fellow. That's Ali Velshi. And he ain't calling for a ceasefire, folks. He's calling for an increased military presence. As I've said on my podcast before, you can send weapons and you can send troops and you can send body bags, or you can send negotiators and envoys. And he's not talking for the latter. He's not calling for the latter. He's calling for the former. There's more of this. Let me play this clip very quickly, and then we'll get to our guest because she's in the wings in the green room, I guess, waiting here. Let's play the second half of this. This is shocking stuff to me.
Proven that time and time again, and he has also pursued the indiscriminate killing of civilians time and time again, twice before in Ukraine and in Chechnya. The global world order and potentially democracy's survival hang in the balance. This isn't the kind of moment that the United Nations and NATO and the UN and the G20 and the Council of Europe and the G7 were made for. What is the point of these alliances if not to stop this? The world cannot sit by as Vladimir Putin continues this reign of terror.
Well, there you go. So that's your call for war, and that's on your left-wing media, such as it is on the national networks. For over on Fox, that nut Sean Hannity was on there arguing vociferously with Tulsi Gabbard, basically for World War III. And Sean Penn was on the airwaves this week, basically intimating maybe, and this guy's considered to be left-wing by some people, but he certainly is not. He's thinking maybe a little bit of a limited nuclear war might be okay. Well, anyway, that's a subject for another podcast. I talked too long, and I wanted to just kind of tell you what's happening today, where I'm at before we brought our guest on, because I didn't want to put her on the spot having to agree or disagree or argue with me about any of this, because that's not why she's here today. And we're just delighted to bring her on the live line here. Let's see if we can get this to come up. Good morning, Ariana Pekary.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, or thanks for having yourself on, coming on the podcast by George, I guess. I'm always on. The thing I wanted to talk to you about today was some new polling that's out, which is, you've got your top line on this polling, and then you've got the detail, the results, and it's all very surprising stuff. And I know that you've seen this, and I want to bring this up for our viewers here and see if I can. All right. So this is Americans view the Weather Channel, the BBC, and PBS as the most trustworthy media organizations. Now, we talked about this very briefly when you were on before, Ariana. Your background was in the public domain with public broadcasting. And this chart comes out and says that how trustworthy do you rate the news reported by the following broadcast, print, or digital media organizations? Display the percentage point difference between trustworthy and untrustworthy among U.S. adult citizens. And this is from YouGov. I wanted to mention that. This is a polling institution, YouGov. The Weather Channel is right at the top of the chart. The BBC is at 24%. The weather, it's kind of funny to me, again, this top line that I talked about, Ariana. The Weather Channel is at 41%. That's the most trusted media outlet. And there's always been a standing joke in this country, particularly in this part of the world. And it's kind of ironic that I started off talking about the weather because people don't trust weather people, supposedly. The standing joke is it's the only profession where you can be wrong half the time or more than half the time and get paid very well. Yet there they sit atop this chart of trust, so to speak, and then the public broadcasting service. So I guess I wanted you to start off talking about PBS and the alignment of these broadcast facilities on the chart as far as how they rate.
Yeah. The Weather Channel, to me, it stands out because it's, not news and politics. So it's hard
Yeah.
to, it is a media organization. I'm glad it's the most trusted, but I feel like, the more you dive into politics, the more people are going to align one way or the other, and that's where the distrust starts to seep in. It's interesting to me that the BBC is behind the Weather Channel as the top trusted outlet. Obviously, it's not an American service, but I feel like if you were to compare the BBC, PBS, and NPR, you would get relatively similar types of news and stories and framing and the tone. And so it's interesting to me that Americans tend to trust the BBC. I think that's good.
Would you say it's all about politics again, to your earlier point? Because Americans don't trust any American outlet because they cover American politics very heavily. Now, the BBC does also, but kind of as a third party outside of this country. So maybe that's why they're saying they trust it.
Yes. But I think they also do quite a bit of cultural programming that people tend to feel comfortable with. And so when you see the difference between the PBS and NPR, which is quite a few notches below, PBS is at 15%, and then NPR is several notches below at 7%. Again, those when you're looking at the actual news itself, it's going to be very, very similar. But PBS does quite a bit less actual news than NPR does every day. NPR is primarily news and public affairs versus PBS, which has the news hour 1 hour a day. And so it's hard to when you talk about trust in the media, people align with what they believe in. And it's not necessarily based on the actual, when you're asking someone whether they trust something or not, it's not necessarily based on the actual content. It's based on, A, how much politics is actually there, but B, is it comforting to them?
Yeah.
And so that's what really strikes me about, this study that came out. And, the more political, more partisan the organizations get, the less trust people have overall.
Let's run through this list here. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt or step on you there, but I particularly because of your knowledge and your background, why the disparity here? We're looking at this list now. We've got the Weather Channel. I kind of get that. The BBC we've explained a little bit. Now, the public broadcasting service continues to rank up there relatively highly, but you got to look at these numbers also. We're talking about plus 15. The Wall Street Journal, again, trusted by people that are probably interested in reading about their finances, and maybe that's why they trust it. CBS, the Associated Press, dropping down kind of where they expect it to. But the disparity that I wanted to have you analyze was the public broadcasting service, PBS, and NPR. Why are they so disparate? What's the difference there between those two in the minds of Americans, do you think?
Well, honestly, I think it goes to the amount of news and politics that is covered on each. If you look at any day you poke in on PBS NewsHour, they will cover, news of the day, same types of stories that are being covered on cable news, but then they, expand out to other topics. They get in, financial studies, they get in economic studies, they, they're able, even now, in the midst of the Ukraine war, they're still continuing on with a kind of a robust span of content and stories. NPR is doing the same thing. Their rundowns, if you kind of pull up the websites and look to see what each is covering on any given day, NPR actually does quite a bit more that is even less. They have more time. Their newscasts are 2 hours versus 1. So they tend to bring in, more news from around the country, and might be some off topics, some cultural or music or literature. But in general, the news topics, there's an awful lot of overlap, and it's delivered in, similar ways. The format is fairly similar between the two. And so it's hard for me, I think, PBS has a longstanding trust factor because it's, Sesame Street, and it's, all of these things that we have grown up with. And so people tend to, there's a certain comfort level there, and they have not infiltrated a PBS. I say use the word infiltrate, but there is limited amount of news and politics that tends to aggravate people one way or the other, whether it's justified or not. And then NPR, they just do quite a bit more of that. They do certainly do the cultural programming, but it's more predominantly news and public affairs, and so that carries a different reputation as well.
Was it NPR that you worked at, or the television side, PBS?
I started at NPR, and then I worked at local stations in San Francisco, and then I worked on a public affairs show that was produced out of SiriusXM, which was technically non-commercial, but we had free reign, and our show did go out onto public radio stations on the weekends. I was there for 7 years.
When you were on before, we spent a lot of time talking about what I call pay to play as far as ratings and advertisers are concerned. What about the criticism now of NPR and PBS as far as they're relying more on their underwriters, their Fortune 500 people that support those programs, and how that's influencing their programming? Are you seeing any of that?
Well, I don't want to say I've been seeing that, but I did, my first job at NPR was working with the ombudsman. And so we took complaints all day, every day from the public, complaints, observations, what have you. But we also got a lot of calls and correspondence from advocacy groups and members of Congress. And the members of Congress who they wouldn't necessarily change the content based on those complaints, but we had to listen to them. And so that is always kind of in the back of your mind. And, with the Ted Cruz's of the world, who are threatening to do away with Big Bird, every so many years, that is always in the back of their minds. And I can tell, I feel like NPR is kind of my main trusted broadcaster in the United States. I still find myself yelling at the radio every now and then when they have, they'll do a certain interview, and I'm guessing why they will have, people on who, through the Trump administration, they would have people on who were with the administration, but also have been known not to tell the truth. And I had a big problem with that. And I know that they're doing this to try to appease the conservatives, whether it's in Congress or, in the audience. And, that brings up a different conversation about bias and who you should be having on and what's fair and balanced. Should we, you give them a place to talk and give their views. But I feel like if it's somebody who, is repeatedly told untruths, fallacies, then that to me is the line that you don't cross. And when I hear that on NPR, it does make me wonder why you hear that. As far as corporate influence, I feel like there was a pretty strong firewall between the development side at NPR and the editorial side. I have never been aware of any specific instance. That's not to say that it hasn't happened, but I just am not aware of that.
Well, from my perspective, I don't know if this is an explanation, or I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I would kind of maybe look at it in this context. Back in the 80s, when I was in radio, Ronald Reagan came to power. Reaganism overtook the country, and they got rid of that fairness doctrine on the radio side. That meant that the radio stations, which were owned by corporations, sometimes major corporations, no longer had to play fair. And that gave rise to Rush Limbaugh. And those guys put Limbaugh on the air, and the Telecom Act in the Clinton administration in league with Newt Gingrich, I believe, allowed for monopolies to own all the radio stations, buy them all up to the point to where, a half dozen companies own them all now. Well, they all syndicated Limbaugh, basically, and Limbaugh owned radio up until his not too long ago demise. NPR is in the radio realm, of course, and on the radio side, there are no listeners on that side of the spectrum, not a single one that has anything positive to say in a poll or otherwise about something like NPR, because that's the world of Limbaugh that still exists, I think, and there's still no left-wing progressive voice on the radio side. And maybe that's what happened in a broad spectrum analysis. I'll say this anecdotally, Ariana, and I don't know what you make of this, but in the last election cycle, I was very interested, and people know this, in the candidacy of Tulsi Gabbard. I'll never forget this. I talked to people a lot about this. She finally got on NPR. They were going to talk about her candidacy and that type of thing. It was one of those afternoon shows on NPR. Maybe it was Fresh Air or something at 2:00 in the afternoon. I was listening closely. The interviewer starts off, right out of the box. Their first question was asking Tulsi Gabbard about her father's religious beliefs and how he was some kind of a, religious cultist. And Tulsi Gabbard took real exception to it, and rightfully so. I was listening at the time. I thought, what the hell? How do you start an interview like this? Tulsi Gabbard said, I thought you were going to talk to me about my presidential candidacy. You want to know about my father's religious beliefs? I'm not prepared or willing to talk about that. So like you said, we all end up yelling at the radio at one time or another. And I was definitely yelling at the radio with NPR on that day.
Yeah. This really, I feel like, kind of gets to the heart of, when you talk about Rush Limbaugh and what happened to the news environment, I went down a deep dive about the fairness doctrine and whether that could make a difference or not. We've seen how people identify with the media, and will say, before they would say that the media was liberal. Well, Eric Alterman wrote a book, umpteen years ago, debunking that myth. Is the media, is this outlet telling stories that make you feel uncomfortable? Is that why, or telling stories about people that don't look like you? Is that why you think that they're biased? I think that has an awful lot to do with it. And, I come from a school of thought that it is incumbent on journalists to tell all of those stories so we have a full representation of the world that we live in. And unfortunately, we know that people, and this is an increasing phenomenon, it started with Rush Limbaugh, and then Fox News picked up that mantle in television, and then MSNBC took it sort of the other direction, and then CNN kind of goes either way it wishes, as it suits them. When Trump was unpopular, they went pretty far to the left, and opinion kind of infiltrated all those programs. They've been a little, you can see that changing over time now that Trump is not in office. But people really align with, when we're talking about trust in the media, people trust what comforts them. And there's this, selective exposure, and people are going to seek outlets that confirm their own natural biases. And there's a study that came out last week that is really fascinating, but really also kind of shows what effect that has on the quality of news that is being delivered and how, what gets to people. We can go into that a little bit if you want, but I don't know if you wanted to react to anything that I've said so far.
Well, no, that's exactly right. It not only comforts them, it reinforces them and their political beliefs, and that's where they're going, and that's where this Slide deck is indicating. We're going to get into that. And for people that are joining us late here, I didn't do a proper job of introducing Ariana. She's an award-winning journalist. She formerly worked in public radio and cable news. That's what we're talking about. And she was on the primetime show hosted by Lawrence O'Donnell at MSNBC. She was behind the camera as a producer on that show. She's now working with the Columbia Journalism Review as a public editor with a focus on CNN. And we're going to be talking about CNN. You'll see them on the chart here coming up. And they are not favoring or not doing very well in this analysis. We kind of stopped here when we were talking about PBS. But as you look at this, Reuters, the Washington Post, ABC, The Guardian, you can see these numbers really declining. NBC, the New York Times, USA Today, Time Magazine. And I don't, I haven't followed that exactly, Times Person of the Year and all that. But my God, what a fall from grace. There was one time when Time Magazine was on every coffee table in America. That's no longer the case. Times have changed. I talk about the fairness doctrine, and so is Ariana. But don't get me wrong. I don't think that would apply or work today. I think it did back then because times were different. Constituencies, listenership, viewership was different. But these companies that maybe would do the right thing back then as far as fairness is concerned because they didn't want to lose their FCC license or even endanger it. I mean, that was part of it also. But I think they just needed a reason to do the right thing. And sometimes they would do it. And so the fairness doctrine worked in the 80s. It wouldn't work today because these corporations and the media outlets and the people that watch them, they're literally, crawling through the windows of the U.S. Capitol, folks. I mean, I don't think the fairness doctrine is a solution. Don't get me wrong. So now we're going into the strong negatives, and this has got to be kind of embarrassing. Newsmax is at -3. CNN, in this poll anyway, and this is probably within the margin of error, but it's below Newsmax. It's down here with One America News, and then look at MSNBC. But again, that's because of all the negatives on the right, recognizing that is the supposed left-wing outlet. But remember Ali Valshi that we had on here earlier. To my mind, that stuff isn't left-wing at all, but Fox News and then Breitbart. So before we move off of this particular slide deck, Ariana, anything you want to say, particularly when it comes to CNN, because I know you're watching those folks closely.
Yeah, I guess it surprised me a little bit that CNN was that low. And, getting into specific numbers, I think what really struck me was how much Republicans really rejected anything that was not an outlet that is clearly in their camp. There's some other graphs and other data down in the study. If you look at that, they completely reject anything that is, center or left of center.
Well, maybe your research shows this. Wasn't CNN kind of a special whipping boy for Trump?
Yeah, and that's where I was going with that. I think that organization took an extra beating from Republicans. Does that explain overall that low trust factor? I don't know. I don't know the numbers that well, but it certainly has taken a beating. And so that again, I think overall these are perceptions that people have of the outlets versus more so than what they're actually like watching and getting information from. So, is that based on an actual content analysis of these?
Yeah.
It's not. It's more based on perception. So.
Okay, great. And I just looked at my clock. We're already probably halfway through this live line. I'm not restricted on time, but Ariana's got things to do, so we got to keep moving here. Let me see if I can bring this next deck up online here. Okay, so which media organizations are trusted more by Democrats and by Republicans? How trustworthy do you rate the news reported by the following broadcast, print, or digital media organizations? The percent who say each organization is very trustworthy or somewhat trustworthy. And as we go through here, there's the venerable Weather Channel at the top. We already talked about that again. Public Broadcasting Service, look at the range there, again, between your Republicans and your Democrats. It's very highly trusted by Democrats, the blue dot to the right there. I mean, we're getting upwards of 60%. And then you go down that list that we talked about earlier, the BBC, CBS, ABC, NBC. the Wall Street Journal. There's your red dots, all is aligned to the left here. I mean, they're not following those channels at all.
Yeah, and looking at this, if you look, at the blue dots going down the right side of that graph,
yes,
it's pretty much all blue dots. And then when you get to a red dot that has high favorability, that is for Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, and Breitbart. So that's when I say that you can tell that Republicans have really rejected any other outlet. That is why. And the news itself has, as an industry, has become politicized. So, and that Donald Trump certainly had an effect, by calling journalists enemy of the state for as long as he did. But it's been building over time, and so again, I just feel like a lot of these numbers are and opinions about the media are more based on what the reputation is of the organization, or what the perception is, or what other people say about it, versus what they actually are getting from those organizations.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about these red dots on the left side. You're talking about the blue dots, with the exception of Fox News, of course, on the right side as far as favorability is concerned. But let's talk about the purple dots. They may be the most important of all here, because these are U.S. adult citizens, and this is the trustworthiness of all of these media outlets, how it's viewed. I mean, you're starting off here with the Public Broadcasting Service, again, Weather Channel at the top, but Public Broadcasting Service, we're talking a little over 40%. Now, Ariana, I'm old enough to remember Uncle Walter, Walter Cronkite. I mean, he was on TV when I was a young person. He might have been to the right of all of these. I mean, he could have been 70% or more. And why is that important? Walter Cronkite, in my era, had a lot to do with ending the Vietnam War. Why? Because he was trusted. He was believed. I mean, you can debate whether or not he actually had that much to do with it, but there are historians that will tell you that he did. Well, that scenario does not exist any longer. These people are all below water. I mean, and you look down here and it goes down, and you're talking about USA Today, and it's about the 38th percentile. And so the overall trustworthiness of Americans when it comes to their media sources is not good. And we're wondering why we can't find our way, why we can't discern truth from fiction. Well, it looks like we don't believe anybody. We're kind of in this caver category, the citizens against virtually everything. Now, the one thing I did want to talk to you about, the blue dots over here, surprisingly, on the left-hand side, as far as favorability is concerned with even Newsmax, but Fox News, you go down there at the very end, you've got One America News. I mean, it's not positive by any stretch of the imagination, but they're getting like 20%, maybe even 20% of what are considered to be, or what people identify themselves as Democrats. What's that all about, do you think?
Oh gosh, I probably because they haven't watched it and they don't know really what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those numbers are pretty small either way, and I don't know what that is about. Maybe liberals, traditionally are more receptive to ideas other than their own. That's kind of the definition of liberal. So that could have something to do with it.
Well, this might be a good time to bring this deck up. Let me see if I can do this, because this is something that I wanted to talk about here, because we've been all around this, but partisan news and the power to change minds. Now, this is another study that's showing what happens when Fox News viewers watch CN instead. Now, this is fascinating, not just from a media perspective, but there's, a socioeconomic dynamic involved in this. I mean, there's a psychology thing involved in all this. This is really interesting stuff. Talk us through this, Ariana.
Yeah, this was a study. These two professors took a large group of hardened Fox News watchers. So they were basing it off of some analytics that, a service that provides, we know that these people watch Fox News pretty much predominantly. Everybody in the household watches Fox News, and they, compared it to voting data. And so they had a group, it was more than 700 people who participated in the study, and they took a subset, I think it was something like 40% of them, and paid them to watch CNN for 1 month during the same hours when they would normally be watching Fox News. And what they found is, this was in September 2020. So this was in the lead up to the election, but we were also obviously in the middle of the pandemic and the George Floyd crisis. They found that after watching CNN for a month, it actually had an effect on the beliefs of these viewers. So they didn't reject out of hand the facts that were being presented to them on CNN. It didn't change them from being Trump voters to Biden voters, but when you dig in on specific topics, looking at this slide here, the people who switched from watching Fox to CNN were 5 percentage points more likely to believe that people would suffer from long COVID, 6 points more likely to believe that foreign countries were doing a better job than the U.S. of controlling the virus. On Fox News at that point, they wouldn't criticize Trump or any of the things that he was doing related to COVID. You were getting that much more so on CNN and MSNBC. They were 10 points less likely to believe that supporters of Biden were actually happy when police officers were to get shot. That was a significant difference between the Fox audience and the CNN audience of normal Fox viewers. So these are people who are hardcore Fox viewers. It had a statistically significant effect on their beliefs at the end of that month. So that there's good news here and there's bad news. The good news is the quality of news and information that you give to people does make a difference on their beliefs, regardless of their pre-inclination or natural bias about something. And when I worked at MSNBC, I was constantly arguing for segments that I thought were good for the audience. And my senior producer finally one day, she said, listen, people don't come to us for the news. They come to us for comfort. And so I think that's what a lot of the organizations have tended to do. And they tell themselves that what we say to the audience isn't going to matter anyway, because they have these preconceived notions. And they aren't going to learn anything other than what they want to learn. But the study shows you that they actually do. It certainly also shows, when you dig into the study and look at what people, the beliefs, how they, the differences, and their actual beliefs about specific things throughout the study. They did have, the CNN watchers tended to have a more fact-based repertoire than the people who were watching Fox only. So that certainly is reflection of Fox News and the quality of content that it is exposing their audience to. But to me, the bigger message is all of these outlets have responsibility to get information out there. And certainly, it's pretty obvious, they might even cover the same subject, say Trump and COVID, but the audiences are going to come out with very different perceptions of that. There are some things to a lesser degree. The Fox audience was better informed than the CNN audience. The Abraham Accords was one of them. In that month, Trump passed this, had this summit in the Middle East that involved several different countries. It was, a step towards peace. I didn't spend a lot of time learning about it, what came of it, but that's, worthwhile step. And the Fox viewers, did know quite a bit more about that than CNN or than the CNN viewers,
because it was covered. It goes back to what you and I were talking about before, on the last show. Sometimes it isn't necessarily what's covered; it's what's not covered, and that probably was not covered very much on CNN or MSNBC.
And again, I know anything like that when I was at MSNBC. Well, no, I just left. But throughout the Trump reign. So that was the campaign and his administration. Anytime, there was something that was remotely positive about his administration, they certainly wouldn't touch it. And anything, when Obama was in office, if there was something negative about Obama, Veterans Affairs was one of the things, and suicides in the military was another thing. That it wasn't necessarily, linked to the president, but it was a reflection of the administration. And it was really, really hard to get those segments on. And what this all comes down to is democratic accountability. I talked to the authors of this study, the one in particular. He kept coming back to this point. The reason why at MSNBC or Fox, why or CNN, why care about what you're informing, what you're teaching your audience is, you might. He used the example of Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. There might be a negative story that comes out about Nancy Pelosi, and they don't want, as a Democrat or a liberal, might not want to make her look bad. But there are other reasons. I mean, she could be primaried, and you may end up with a better Democrat. It's a way of holding politicians accountable. And if that's, your core audience, that is an important opportunity to hold these people accountable. And that's just not being done really anywhere. And so that to me is the really important thing. And it's the study really shows what else could be done through this partisan media. As bad as that partisan media is, they still have an ability to make a difference.
Huge. I mean, when I look at that, that's what I start thinking about, like Newton Minow and Orwell. And yes, I mean, this is, you can't overstate the influence that media has on the psyche of Americans in particular. Even though we started off looking at this chart talking about who they say they trust, I mean, they are influenced by this stuff big time, folks. These networks know that. And of course, one of the big things that is influencing America now, to a small degree, is Podcast by George, but to a big degree are these YouTube shows and podcasts. Now, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because your national media outlets recognize this, and CNN does in particular. They launched something called CNN Plus. I know you follow the mothership, Ariana, but I was wondering what your perception of this was. It's struggling to lure viewers in its early days, drawing fewer than 10,000 daily users. Fewer than 10,000 people are using CNN Plus on a daily basis 2 weeks into its existence. Now, it's early, but still, folks, I want to put this in context. Joe Rogan, he has between 7 and 10 million viewers. Joe Rogan does. Jimmy Dore, who I follow and I talk about on the show quite a bit, he's got 1 million subscribers. And not only are they struggling to get 10,000 people to watch this thing, which is supposed to be out there in the same domain, they're spending a boatload of money trying to boost this thing, millions of dollars. I think tens of millions of dollars I read to get this CNN Plus thing to work.
It's ballpark.
Yeah.
Because it's less than 100 million, but some reports said it was more than 100 million. I think there are several different things going on here. And to me, the primary thing is they, for better or worse, they were trying to create something new and a bit less politicized. So that's why you see Chris Wallace on CNN Plus. He left Fox and went to CNN Plus. Casey Hunt from MSNBC, who was, she was on MSNBC, but she was kind of more of a straight news person, reporter for a long time and correspondent. Eva Longoria, they've done some cultural programming. So they were trying to create the space for more, not neutral, but they didn't necessarily want it to be the politicized, opinion-based programming that you see so much on CNN. And that, I think, was coming from the ownership, the board. John Malone was coming in, and he had said he really wants to, he made some comments about, complimenting Fox News, which is, real journalism, and wanted to see CNN, move more in that direction. And I think that that's probably what influenced a lot of CNN Plus. They were trying to make a distinction between what you see on the linear television versus what is
Yeah.
on the streaming service. So there's that. What they're already after, what, a week or 2 weeks, they're already talking about rolling it back. So there really wasn't, that's the problem. They're just not a commitment to stay with anything that might be different. And it might take longer for people to develop an appreciation. It might take longer for people to feel like, oh yeah, this is worth, $5 a month.
Well, and that's key. Do you think it would have been different, to your point?
Well,
CNN Plus, you can get all that stuff on CNN, right? Why would you pay to get it on CNN Plus? Or for instance, was it going to actually include a left-wing perspective? That would be, I might even pay to get that, but I don't think that it was. I think it was going to be CNN redo.
It was going to end up being CNN redo, and that's probably where it will end up going. Still, I just don't trust the commercial financial incentives that are built in. I mean, they were going to be going for individual subscribers. I figure at some point they would probably get bundled in with one of the other streaming services, because I don't see people paying $5.99 a month for the service that's kind of delivering, I don't know, whatever it is that they were delivering. They know opinion, makes money. People will go to that for, their banal human tendencies. But trying to create something new, there really obviously just wasn't a commitment to doing that. And, that's my experience. And if you're going to do that, you have to stay committed. If you are trying to provide something that's really a service that is different, you really have to stick with it. And they barely gave it 2 weeks. So, or based on the reporting. So, again, I just, the commercial market, I don't think that, I feel like monetizing the news is very dangerous. Rare cases have you seen it succeed. And this is just another example of that.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about the internet and its programming. When they first started this, and I'm old enough, again, I was around when this all began. I think they looked at it, the people that were the pioneers of the internet and programming, and thought, well, nobody's ever going to pay for this, so we're not going to charge a subscription. We're going to try to cover some of the cost with advertising. Well, of course, now it's all advertising paid for, and that's even more nefarious because that's kind of moving around behind the scenes. That's what your primary complaint has been. That's why it's influencing secretly behind the curtain, and we're not even aware of it. And that's now became, it's become the case with the internet as well.
That certainly has an effect on people like Alex Jones and Joe Rogan. They may have, may have their, personal beliefs, and that's probably how they got started. But over time, those incentives, they need to become more and more colorful and what they're doing, and controversial to get people to tune in. And I think that's what we're seeing in the podcast internet world.
Well, we're running out of time here. If anybody's got another question, kind of a late breaking question for Ariana, please pose it now, because we're going to try to get her on her way here within the next 10 minutes or so. That pretty much was all of the questions that I had. Now, that chart that we were looking at, that YouGov survey, they also surveyed the personalities and who people trust. It was interesting. I'm not going to bring the slide up. It was pretty basic stuff. Again, you've got your Republicans and your Democrats and their particular platforms and who they trust and don't trust. That blue dot, again, was kind of interesting when I looked at it. Some Democrats trust Sean Hannity, again, in that 20% realm. Like, what in the hell? I mean, my God. Yeah, it might be an anomaly, might be within the air of margin of error. Now, Tucker Carlson is the same way, but again, that might be attracting some of the extreme left-wing progressives on some issues. They seem to like that libertarian perspective of Tucker Carlson. I mean, that could be present there as well. The other thing that was kind of interesting, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this or not, I think the guy that they trust the most, the Democrats, on the was Anderson Cooper.
Yeah.
And I look at that guy, but some people say it's because he's so boring. He's so inoffensive. I mean, so they actually trust him because he seems, anyway, to be less opinionated. But again, as we started off the show with that film clip, video clip, I guess I should say, they are manufacturing consent in their own way, I believe. Sometimes knowingly, maybe sometimes unwittingly. But what do you think about that as far as the more boring you are, the more trustworthy you are? Because Walter Cronkite was accused of being boring too.
Yeah, no, I think that Anderson Cooper is, his favorability rating is standing on his long-standing reputation as kind of a straight news guy. I think that has been how he has tried to sell himself throughout most of his career. The dangerous, that to me is one of the real dangers that we have here. He, through the Trump administration, really slid much more into opinion. And if you are a lefty, you probably, or even not a lefty, if you didn't like Donald Trump, you liked what Anderson Cooper had to say. There was a day when he compared Donald Trump to an obese turtle flailing on his back. Yes,
yeah, that's right. I remember that.
It is funny, but the danger coming from somebody like Anderson Cooper is that pushes away a significant audience, and it's going to be really hard to get them back. For the right reasons or wrong, half, not half, but a large percentage of the country did vote for Donald Trump. Millions of people. And we need to keep them at the table where they're going to get reliable information. Now, they, a core group of that people might not have been watching Anderson Cooper, but there are certainly enough independents who would have been watching CNN. And if they saw that and they had any sympathy towards the Republican Party, or if they were right of center, that sort of comment is going to push them away into the darker corners of the media. And it really is, that to me is the big threat here. He has, built up a more liberal leaning audience. And then you see that how that changes once Donald Trump is kind of off the scene, and, they are looking for some sort of conflict, something, manufacturing consent in the Biden administration. And so when Afghanistan happens, CNN went all in on the Biden administration, but there was a lot that went into that evacuation that they were not explaining. This was a deadline set up, first of all, by Donald Trump, a peace agreement with the Taliban set up by Donald Trump. None of that was explained, and Anderson Cooper was one of them. And to your, as you saw when the Ukraine war started, he was one of the first on the front lines there. And so at that point, he probably had a large contingent of liberal and independent voters who liked what he had to say and, quote, trusted him. But once that outlet starts, criticizing the Biden administration, then that has that has that much more of an effect on those voters or those viewers. So all of a sudden they give him that much more credence, in his opinion or the network's opinion about Joe Biden. And so that to me is a real danger when you're pretending to be one thing, but you really aren't, and you're just, it's a show more than anything. It's not reliable, and it's not really the partisan media. It's just too confusing for people. If they see an anchor sitting at a desk, they think that that's somebody who, in theory, they could trust, but we know that it's just much more complicated than that.
Well, you kind of gently tap my hot button, because I wouldn't say trust them at all. I think disclaimers ought to be on all of these major news outlets, to the effect of, we were wrong about Iraq, we were wrong about Afghanistan, we were wrong about Libya, we were wrong about Syria with chemical gas attacks.
They keep bringing these people back on.
Yeah, it's been, honest to God, and now Ukraine. What, you're you're going to trust them implicitly. You're going to follow them blindly when it comes to this. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all of those guys. They were all wrong. Most notably, Joe Biden included. The Fox people. I mean, leave them out there where they're at. But my God, about Iraq. And again, 1 million dead civilians have paid with their lives for that. Innocent men, women, and children. Well, that kind of takes us out. We're running out of time. The only other thing I would say is boring helps maybe to get trusted with some of these news hosts. The other
you don't
thing,
have to be boring. You can be interesting and factual. And you can be a good storyteller. And I'm not a good storyteller, but there are better ways of going about this than just either being plain Jane boring or crazy partisan.
The other thing in the poll was a couple of more trusted hosts were David Muir. A lot of people don't know who he is. They know the name and that type of thing. Brent Baer, who I guess is a Fox News. That Brent Baer dude, his net worth is like $60 million. People don't realize that. And again, here comes my hot button. People don't realize that these people that you're trusting with life and death when it comes to telling us whether or not to go to war, for instance, they are not like me. For certain, I've never met anybody like any of these people. Anderson Cooper is a Vanderbilt, Ariana. I mean, his net worth is what, $100 million or something like that. I mean, I don't know anybody like that. These people, Anderson Cooper's got an intelligence background. He was with the CIA. People don't know this stuff. I mean, and we go right to the television set blindly in the evening, and we follow them on things like war, for God's sake. Well, anyway, that's going to be my closing little rant, I guess. Anything here that I didn't get to that you wanted to make sure that you underscored or emphasized before we let you go? And again, thanks so much for your very gracious time.
No, I would just say, if you are telling yourself that you follow or you trust a certain outlet, you might want to ask yourself why exactly. I think that's a good thing for everybody to reflect on a little bit, myself included.
Yeah, and seek out other sources of information. Look around. I mean, don't just restrict yourself to somebody that reinforces your current beliefs, because sometimes, to quote John Mellencamp, they could be wrong. Folks, our guest today is Ariana Pekary. She's an award-winning journalist. She formerly worked in public radio and cable news, where she became an integral part of a primetime show. It's that one hosted by Lawrence O'Donnell over on MSNBC, folks. She's now working to rethink financial incentives in broadcast news through public awareness and advocacy. And back in September 2020, she joined Columbia Journalism Review as a public editor with a focus on CNN. Ariana Pekary, thanks again for coming on this Podcast by George LiveLine.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have you back on again soon, I'm sure, because this is, as you could hear me, this is a hot button issue with me. And folks, if you like a Podcast by George, my final salutation or closing, whatever you want to call it, as always, go to podcastbygeorge.com. and sign up. Choose a platform. If you want to just get the audio, you don't want to look at my ugly mug, I get that. Sign up on iTunes and Spotify, Stitcher, any of the audio platforms that are on podcastbygeorge.com. But if you like the video, if you like the graphics and the videos, and you like seeing people like Ariana, please go to Podcast by George and sign up for Facebook or YouTube, and you'll get the videos. And most importantly, if you ring the notification bell on YouTube and subscribe, you'll be notified of each and every new broadcast. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.